Hey everybody, Kate with Crate Insider. I'm here today with Don Blackshear from Pace Performance. And Don is a big resource for me when I have questions about engines, especially with Crate engines. And I have lots of questions. So I really appreciate you taking the time with me today. And my question for you today is, I know that you get the phone calls just like I do, where the question is, well, tell me, what is the horsepower that this makes? Or how do your engines compare to somebody else's? Tell me a little bit about dynos.
Well, the thing with an engine dyno or a chassis dyno, it's basically a test tool, okay? And they vary. Different manufacturer dynos read different numbers. Chassis dynos are the same way. The difference between the chassis dyno and the engine dyno is the chassis dyno is what I call real-world dyno testing, because you can start the pull at 1500 RPM just like you would be on the racetrack and accelerate up to peak RPM. So you look at the torque curve and the power curve of the engine, and it helps you tune the carburetor, the headers, different things on the car to free up acceleration rate of the engine, and that gives you more of what I call a real-world number. But they're still variables. Carburetors, types of fans, types of water pumps, pulley speeds, types of fuel that are in the engine, the ignition system that's utilized, whether it's an MSD type ignition or whether it's an HEI type ignition, whether you're allowed a locked advance curve, whether you're not. There's so many variables to it. So basically it becomes a test tool is what it is, and it can vary from shop to shop.
Well, and I think that's an important thing to consider is the fact that when you ask for a dyno number, I understand that I know from an outsider when I first started this, that I thought if I asked for a dyno number, that a dyno number would be a universal, that it would be a scientific standard, but it is not. And then plus there's adjustments that you can do on either one of these kind of dynos, correct?
Sure. There's so many things that control it. Your correction factor for the dyno. Some dynos, depending on if they have the carburetor sealed to the air intake, there's so many variables that can affect it. The GM dyno process with it, you'll find that most all the engines fall within 2 to 3 horsepower of what the GM recommendation is at that RPM. The 602s, just for example, they're pretty consistent when it comes to that. But when the engine builder's ability to tune it with different timing curves or timing settings, going through the processes of make sure that the balancer is indexed at true top dead center. That's one of the processes that most all engine shops, and we do at Pace, because these things are mass-produced components and there's inconsistencies in them. So in turn, that's probably one of the first processes, to do to the engine is just to index everything so that top dead center is true top dead center and your timing mark is very accurate.
Yes, and that way, well, then let me ask you this then, because also GM's going to test, they're going to have their dyno settings at a particular thing. But those could be varying from shop to shop. But just as I think, let's talk about the ratings, because I think the 602, for instance, I believe is rated at about 350. Am I right?
Yes, they're rated around 350. The newer design engines, when they went through the piston change, they went to a thinner ring package in it. So we saw a little bit of performance increase there. On our particular dyno that we utilize with my dyno carburetor, my spec fuel I use, my timing that I utilize, the engines usually fall in that 368 to 372 for a peak power range. And the torque numbers are usually in the 410 to 418 range is usually where they fall, depending on the header and the weather conditions and things of that nature, because temperature affects all this stuff. So, but that's where they fall on our dyno. I've heard some dynos higher, I've heard some dynos lower, and that's why I say it's just a test tool. And we run hundreds of engines across the dyno at Pace. With our 602, 604, and our CT525 program, and I just utilize the same carburetor, same fuel, it has the same specific gravity, same headers to try to just duplicate. And I have my tolerances that I work within, and the engine falls within this range, and that's a good engine to me, and out the door it goes to the consumer.
Right, and if you saw it like really ridiculously low, if you saw it come through at like 320 or something, you're gonna be like, whoa, there's something wrong here.
Yeah, the thing with my program, when you call at Pace, we sell engines as from GM, but in our Circle Track department, we do offer a race prep dynoed engine. And the very first process that I do when I remove it out of the crate is I leak every cylinder in it. We do not do repairs at Pace, so it's not like an engine shop that's verified to do repairs or rebuilds on the engine where they could correct a problem. I have to know I have a good piece right out of the box. So I go through and leak every cylinder down on it, and if it falls within my specification range, then I'll start my process of indexing the balancer, doing the match valve springs, and race prepping the distributor, where I'll lock the advance curve and the mechanical advance curve. I also index the rotor and phase the pickup in it and set the in place so it keeps consistent ignition timing through the whole RPM cycle. So I know when I go to the dyno, I've got a good piece. Time is money in everyone's world, and I don't want to waste time on something that's going to be a dud. So I usually catch that before I ever get started. So me spending 15, 20 minutes leaking it down saves me hours worth of time.
Well, and you just gave me a brilliant tech tip to share, because, if you're buying a new crate engine in the box, I've certainly recommended leak downs to find out if there's something wrong with your engine. If you're halfway through the season, you're like, I'm kind of dropping off on power, the first thing we say is to do a leak down. But this advice to, when you're buying a brand new engine, to do a leak down on day one, I think that's brilliant.
Right. And the thing is, there was some machining processes and stuff that there was some hiccups on, and we were finding that the valve jobs in them were drastically bad, where we would have excessive cylinder leakage through exhaust valves or intake valves. And on a low horsepower, low compression engine like a 602, it's detrimental to the power output. And 9 times out of 10, when customers would call and say, my engine doesn't feel like it's performing as good as the last one, and I would ask them to say, hey, we'll go leak it down and see what it leaks, and we can go from there. And 9 times out of 10, you find an issue, something in the valve train with the valve job, because the piston, the rotating assembly, the blocks and that type of stuff, those things seal up. And you really don't see issues with that. It's usually with the valve job is something, is why it might be down a little bit on power. But we try to cure that right from the get-go by going through our leak testing process, and it just saves me a lot of time.
Well, and it definitely saves a racer having a bad night at the track.
Yep, absolutely. In a lot of the shops that I've talked to, they go through the same processes, so it's nothing new. They still do it. Some of the shops will go through that right away, and hey, we've got a problem. Well, then we can maybe help them with that, being it's never been on the racetrack also. So it gives us a way to help the engine shop out if they've purchased an engine and it does have an issue.
Well, and one other question, since we are talking about dynos, let's talk about for a moment the difference between an engine dyno and a chassis dyno. If you have the same engine that you take from an engine dyno, and then now we drop it into a car and put it on a chassis dyno, are we going to see the same numbers?
No, you won't see the same numbers. You usually, on an average, if you have the correct components, transmission, rear end, things of that nature, you'll usually see a 10 to 14% power loss being in the car versus on the engine dyno. The unique thing about, like I said, about the chassis dyno is your ability to simulate real world conditions. Rolling along in a restart at 1500 RPM, and you flop the throttle wide open and it sweeps itself up to 6,000 or 6,200, wherever your limit's at on your 602. It shows you the acceleration rate of the engine. So it allows you to tune the carburetor, the squirters, the squirter cams, headers, mufflers, all that stuff to help the engine accelerate. And that's something here in the last 6 to 8 months, there's been a lot of development on headers. And on the engine dyno, you can't load the engine that low of RPM. We start our dyno pulls at 3,000 RPM because you can't really load it any lower than that and sweep it to the peak RPM on a water brake style engine dyno. So when you're on that chassis dyno, it really allows you to work on developing the header package for it, the muffler, the tailpipes, everything that you can do to help the acceleration rate of that engine.
Yeah, because that's all going to be on the torque end, and the torque end is all before 3,200. Am I correct?
Well, the torque curve of the engine on the 602 is very critical because it makes more torque than it does horsepower. And the torque range is so broad in that engine, so in turn, the better you can help it accelerate earlier, the faster it's going to be on the racetrack, and usually the more front bumpers you're going to buy because you're bumping people in the rear end on restarts. So that's what I tell guys. If you find acceleration rate on the chassis dyno, you ought to buy another front bumper because you're probably going to use it on somebody on a restart. So
Well, I love that. And I probably sell some front bumpers around there too.
There you go.
So thank you so much. I think those were some great tips, great knowledge just to share with you. And any other questions, go ahead and drop them in the comments. And, so we'll see if we can address them, or maybe I can get together with Don again and do another little tech video. But thank you so much for watching. Thank you, Don, for your time today.
Absolutely. It's been my pleasure, Kate.